Uh, John, I'd like to ask a question having read the book. And as you go through the book, it clearly builds upon itself. And empirically, you get closer and closer to the last chapter. And as you pointed out, many of us, as soon as we got the book, turned to the chapter on sex and then went back to chapter one again. Is there any particular chapter, and I don't want to say your favorite, but something that resonated all the way through that you found key? And not saying it's any more important than any other part, but something that you felt particularly profound yourself that helped to put the entire book together.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. That's a great question. Um, I knew for several years that the last chapter was going to be called Renewable Pleasure for a Sustainable World. A book, you start at a beginning and there's a kind of narrative trajectory, and then you finally get to an ending point. And that ending point is like the clasp of a buckle. So the very first chapter and the very last chapter, they really need to come together and be shiny, be strong. So I had known that the last chapter was going to be titled Renewable Pleasure for a Sustainable World. And I thought, kind of in a very straightforward way, well, yeah, some pleasures are not so renewable and others are more so. For example, if you walk along a beach, that leaves a very small carbon footprint. But if you have to fly 1,000 miles to get there, it's a much bigger footprint. And so you could create a continuum of renewability or green pleasures, if you will. And that's where I started thinking that, yeah, okay, that's a great way to tie this book together. But I was startled as I started thinking about renewable pleasure, and this is really one of the great um, satisfactions of writing a book. One of the great excitements is that the book takes on a life of its own. And in that sense, I become the scribe. So as I'm thinking about renewable pleasure, it suddenly realized that, wow, renewable pleasure, that kind of sounds like a resource. And I realized that indeed, pleasure is a natural resource, as essential to good health and well-being as fresh air and clean water. All right, thinking about pleasure as a natural resource is very powerful because it immediately takes away all of our cultural biases that have been accumulating for a couple thousand years. And now we can simply look at it as we would look at any other resource. So then, being a natural resource, who should be in control of it? How is it cultivated? Where is it found? How is it distributed? And that then led me to a further understanding that as a natural resource, pleasure as a natural resource, the deepest pleasure, the highest quality pleasure, actually is derived from another human being. That is, each one of us is a potential wellspring of renewable pleasure for ourselves and the world. And it's in the exchange of this person-to-person pleasure, which in a sense is what we're doing right now. We're having a conversation. It's in that exchange that we gain access and can experience this high quality pleasure. And then I realized, wow, if that's the case, if each one of us is a wellspring of this pleasure for each other, why don't we just give it to each other? And that turns out to be a really radical suggestion because our whole culture is built around not being able to give it to each other, that there have to be middlemen, people mediating in between that control the exchange of pleasure. And of course, this then drives our whole culture. That much of our motivation, and certainly my motivation, if I really get to be honest about it and think about it, a lot of the desire to have a good job, make money, have a nice house, a nice car, family, etc., the right clothes, be well known. A lot of that is driven by this feeling, this belief that, you know, if I do those things, then I will get the human renewable pleasure that I long for, that we all long for. Unfortunately, it often doesn't work out that way, right? We find very famous people, very wealthy people, very powerful people who are living wretched lives because they are not actually getting the renewable pleasure they hoped that they would. So does that answer your question? What do you think about that as a
Probably raises more, so I'm gonna have to go back to the book. But it does bring it into a circle, neither a beginning nor an end, as to your experiences and how they relate to our own experiences.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, Bob, as a successful man, I've always admired your ability to do that. And do you feel like that in and of itself has brought you deep happiness, deep pleasure, satisfaction, fulfillment?
You're referring to the possessions, and I've never really thought about that. That hasn't been important to me.
Hmm.
Some of it has come just because of who you are, or when, you know, you get lucky, but sometimes you make your own luck. But that's not really, you know, that's never been one of my goals.
Yes, yes. You know, and it's interesting. I've asked this of many people who are successful, you know, objectively, outwardly successful. And many of them say, yeah, you know, I was just really lucky.
Yeah.
There's a lot of truth to that. You know, there's a lot of truth to that.